Hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I am your host, Shawn Needham, along with my beautiful wife, Janet, and our producer, Lindsay. We are streaming live in the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy Studio today. Beautiful day in Moses Lake, beautiful sunny day, kind of cold. We have definitely transitioned when it comes to weather, but it's all good. I love the season. So today we have Dr. Ashley Triboulet on our show. I got that right. I don't speak French. I think that's French.
Yes, you did. Excellent.
And I practiced a lot because actually Dr. Triboulet is a Moses Lake native and she graduated with our wonderful producer, Lindsay. So from high school. So that's kind of how we were introduced. And she has a great story for us today. As always, you can catch us live right here on my personal Facebook account, Shawn Needham's personal Facebook account. You can also catch us streaming live on the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy YouTube site. Please subscribe to our YouTube site. If you do, you won't miss any episodes. There are 80 some episodes now. I think it's 88, 89 episodes, full episodes, but we also have multiple videos off those episodes, little 1 to 3 minute segments. So for those of you that are like me and don't have an attention span long enough for an hour episode, we've got little tiny clips on there. They're great to share on Instagram and Twitter and those formats that don't always take the longest videos. So please go to our YouTube site, like it, and podcasts. We are on all the podcast forums. Okay, all is a pretty strong term. I try to stay away from that term. We are on most of the podcast forums. So iHeart, iTunes, SoundCloud. What am I forgetting?
Spotify.
I always forget Spotify, which is weird because I stream music on Spotify. So we're on all those podcast forums. So please go to those podcast forums, subscribe to it, comment on all those forums. Please let us know your feedback. We really appreciate it. Let us know future guests you might like to have on the show, or future topics. We are. I shouldn't say limited. We have a broad spectrum of everything healthcare. So nothing, I wouldn't say nothing. That's a strong word too. But most things are not off limit because we can talk about anything healthcare. So please check us out on all those other forums too and comment. So now back to Dr. Triboulet. Dr. Triboulet, you have a wonderful story, a personal story, and people love personal stories. You have a wonderful story about personal story about why you became a naturopath because you have some health conditions yourself. So why don't you go ahead and start off our show with telling us that story?
Oh my heavens! Thank you so much for introducing me. I'm glad to be here. And yes, I went into naturopathic medicine because of my own story. So the general overview of it is I have an autoimmune condition. It's almost taken my life twice. And it's caused me a lot of medical consequences in terms of income, and I've a lot of my adulthood and relationships have been affected by it too. But it's made me very passionate and very interested in a holistic approach towards health. So that's really why I went into natural medicine. My experience is when I was growing up, I started to have skin and GI issues, which was related to also a lot of the environment I grew up in. And I think it correlates well to what we're going to talk about today with toxic stress syndrome and a lot of the conversation we're going to have. But our environment has a big impact on our development. And that, I believe, has a big impact on my expression of my autoimmune condition and the fulminancy of the disease. I tried a bunch of different rheumatological medications, what we call DMARDs. They didn't work well with me. In fact, I'm kind of one of the sensitive ones where I had a lot of the adverse reactions in trying them. My immune system is different. It's very different. And so when we changed or shifted, I had a lot of the side effects and I had other issues that come up with infections. So it was not helpful for me. So going into naturopathic medicine, I had a chance to learn both the traditional medical sciences and the conventional medical sciences, and I didn't have the dogma of all the pharmaceutical companies making me have to learn their education programs. We got to learn more outside of the box natural science approaches, and it gave me the opportunity to really look into nutritional sciences, biochemistry, understanding the body's reaction. We don't really look at the body's reaction as much as conventional medicine, I think, really looks more at the organisms or the different conditions, and not the body as much. And naturopathic functional providers really value optimizing body's function first before going into higher force interventions. So there's a lot of opportunities to holistically help yourself, and actually that's what helped me the most was the basics: sleeping, eating really good food, and that is generalized. A lot of people generalize what eating well is, and even exercise. Yeah, functional exercise.
Well, it's amazing you said those three things, because we talk about it all the time on this podcast. There's really three things that we can do to make our body healthy in general, and that's eat, exercise, and sleep. And
so true.
Yeah, and sleep is the most important, as you probably know. Sleep is recovery is so important. So, yeah, I'm glad you're on, because you really fit the model of our podcast. So, can you tell us a little bit about what was in your environment that caused some of these issues? Can you tell us about that?
There's a lot of things that were in my environment. So my family divorced young. My mom has a lot of chronic pain challenges. I don't really want to go into my mom's story very much, because I want to, be mindful of her experiences and her wanting to keep that private. But there was a lot of things that, if we talk about, for example, the adverse childhood events studies, there was a lot of exposures me and my family had growing up, given the transitions and the experiences. So I'll go into that if you like. But the upbringing and my own personality made me very sensitive to having a disease expressed early on.
Okay, so actually, I think it's a good segue to lead into what we're talking about with toxic stress, because that's obviously a stressor, and our childhood events was a stressor. Whether,
Big deal.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes what I was thinking when you said environmental stress, I was thinking, okay, what you're talking about is, possibly you grew up with a house with mold in it, or,
Okay.
you know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah.
but you're talking more about, relationshipal issues when it comes to stress. Is that correct?
I think in regards to the conversation we're having today, yes. But in general, my philosophy and what we're taught in school is about environmental health. So it is what we're eating, what we're drinking,
Absolutely.
what chemicals are in our environment. Those all affect, especially kiddos, development. Yeah. So, and relationships are underestimated. It's a cultural, I think, it's something that we've suppressed in culture is relationships. It's something that's more insidious to see. How do emotions, how do we talk about them? They're not physical. They're not something we can see and manipulate. There's something that we have to better understand in more of an energetic way.
Well, and I think as we have progressed our podcast and progressed how we want to educate and empower patients to control their health, to those three things with eating, sleeping, and exercise, we really have added a fourth one, and really it's called relationships. And relationships, whether bad or good, definitely affect your life. So those are the four things that we can really do to keep us healthy. So go into the, how you got into the toxic stress and what you do with your coaching as a naturopath.
Yeah, so during this time, I got to open a coaching program to really help people with the transition of having to be at home and working together when we're used to working apart. So there's a lot of issues with mental health right now. And well, that's been something that's been an issue previously, but it's now more apparent. But also relationship communication and the stresses that happen within being back together as a family unit. So in regards to the definition of toxic stress, I think it's important to understand, because what we're talking about is not chronic stress as an adult. I'm talking about like there's a difference between that and like post-traumatic stress disorder and just chronic stress than toxic stress. Toxic stress is actually something that happens in childhood that's a prolonged stress that is affecting the nervous system, and it shapes the brain architecture in a way in a child that makes them predisposed to having physical and mental issues when they become an adult, and also attracts more of the same sort of relationships. So it's really important to understand how this shapes the nervous system, and from the top down, and the big axes, we call it the HPA axis, and the even the hormone axis with the ovaries and the testicles. It's really important to understand these as they're growing, and how it is affected from adverse childhood events. So the toxic stress, something that's really helpful for people to learn about is adverse childhood events. We know that adverse childhood events is a big study from the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. They did this survey on about 17,500 adults to look at childhood adversities that then were correlated to physical and mental issues as they aged. And we found that if you have more than 4, you actually have like a 12 times increased risk of suicide. You have a double risk of depression, dementia. You have immune issues, autoimmune, COPD, asthma is more, there's more incidence of that in the population with more adverse childhood events as adults. And then there's also a lot of cognitive issues. So this has huge effects on kids and learning with this sort of exposure young.
So, Janet, do you have any questions for Dr. Triboulet?
So I'm assuming that COVID is making this a little bit higher on the charts for families and kids.
Yeah.
So how is your coaching taking off from what you were doing prior to the COVID pandemic?
Well, this is a great question. So, this is the first time I've ever been online and doing an online sort of thing. It's really taking off. I was kind of nervous because online is much different than it is in private practice, and it's a whole different type of marketing and everything. So, fortunately, being a millennial, I was able to apply a lot of my technology skills and marketing skills to a lot of my automating coaching. So it's growing. Definitely comparing it to other businesses in the growth phase, it is definitely growing, and it's necessary.
So
Yeah.
tell us some of the things. Do you work with people that are in a situation like that, or is it usually after they've they're adults and they're had previous exposure to toxic stress?
Oh, okay. So mostly my population I work with is adults. I like really helping adults understand how the toxic stress is affecting them and their life today with their relationships, for example. This is something that can be regarded to like my area of interest on online coaching is teaching resilience and understanding chronic pain holistically and adopting natural health strategies and self-help tools through communication to better their relationships. And a lot of individuals are dealing with not understanding their own maladaptive coping issues, and also what's happening in the media today and everything else. So everything in life. But my main demographic is mostly adults to help them better teach their kids.
So you mentioned that a lot of times with a toxic relationship, possibly when they were kids, they will revert back to toxic relationships as adults. Did I catch that right?
Yes. So I see this is kind of anecdotal. There's some research to definitely suggest there's a more vulnerable component to individuals living similar patterns. The brain goes to what is familiar. And so what we learn in key times during development is what we attract in our adult life. And so it really takes us a lot more effort coaching, mental health therapy, working with good providers that are really educating you, as well as giving you different choices to help you make better decisions in what you're doing in your life. So if we have these mental models of I'm not good enough, toxic shame I call it, we have learning deficits, which also contributes to toxic shame. We weren't taught how to emotionally regulate, which that would be how to deal with what we're feeling, which is kind of contributing to this mindfulness era that we have going on right now. Then we are more at risk for attracting the same thing. And that's why we have these families that we see, hurt people.
So how would you deal with a patient that is in a situation like that? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's two different sectors here. So the clinical acumen that I have is wonderful because I have the background in understanding biology and the different mental health conditions that can contribute to a person's ability to make decisions for themselves. Like this is the difference between mindset, motivation, and depression, right? So if somebody's clinically depressed, you have to be able to see that as a provider to make sure you're giving them the right prioritization of different treatment options so that they could actually be successful in their goals. So in the coaching program, I make it required that they've already dealt with all of their, they're working with a mental health counselor, or if they're on psych medications, they have a good provider. I'm very well versed in that. And I do help them, I help educate individuals around their medications, but I make sure that I'm communicating with the provider that they have in regards to that too.
So it is including not only their mental health treatments, but what they can do with their own self, with decisions and tools to be able to feel better and heal.
Yeah, so like a coach, the difference between a coach and a lot of people ask this question, what's the difference between a coach and a mental health counselor? Well, there's a big difference actually. Coaches are not allowed to, if they're going to be in different states, they're not trained to practice in medicine. They're not trained in diagnostic intervention, all that. Yes, I am licensed and I do have that training, but that's something I don't offer online. This is more lifestyle, communication skills,
right,
behavioral hacks per se, to teach the things that are missing in different programs that they can get from insurance reimbursed care.
So it's hands-on things that people can apply.
Yeah, I give them. Yep, I give them worksheets. I give them. It's all up-to-date neuroscience that I integrate in here. A lot of natural health sciences too, but I give them nutrition. I help them understand how hormones impact their actual decision making. There's a lot of stuff we don't talk about in regards to mindset and motivation, and that is our physiology. Like, what is going into our decision making, and how can we actually adopt a better lifestyle to make better decisions?
Now, can you expand on nutrition? So when you say you're going to help somebody with toxic stress and you're going to talk about nutrition, what would you specifically talk about? I know that's very individual, so that's a broad question, but give me some examples.
The first thing I would talk to them about is, what is your self-care routine? How are you seeing yourself, and what kind of love and what kind of relationship do you have with you? Because a lot of us, especially women, we're not looking at ourselves. We're doing everything for everyone else. So I see more women than men. I have to say that in my coaching. In my clinical practice, I see more men than women. But in regards to nutrition, where I would start with any gender is I would talk to them about what they're eating. I'd want to kind of know how much they're eating in a day, and then what kind of food groups they're eating. I'd also want to know their income and what kind of limits they have, because I wouldn't want to put more stress on them by making, choose organic versus non-organic foods. So I can even prioritize like the dirty dozen, for example, go for those in organic, and strategize what works in your budget for more quality food. It may not be organic though.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Dirty Dozen, please?
Yeah, so the Dirty Dozen is all the fruits and vegetables that absorb the most pesticides that you really don't want to get non-organic. So you're going to absorb a lot of pesticides from them. So we see that like in grapes, we see that in strawberries, we see that in lettuces. I don't remember the specific food groups, but you can just Google Dirty Dozen and it'll give you the food groups to really go organic with.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know. All right. So, Janet, do you have more questions for Dr. Triboulet?
So since we're talking about nutrition, let's move to maybe some tools that you use with the physical side, the how people are taking care of their body physically.
Oh, yes. If we put this in relation to toxic stress syndrome, so let's say a person, I'm working with an adult that had a family background of physical abuse, substance abuse. They're hitting more than 4 of the ACEs, which if you hit more than 4, again, you're going to have more risk of cardiometabolic immune issues and mental health issues. So one, I'm assessing them there in terms of understanding their ability to comply, but also their relationship with pain. So a lot of times with people that have more than 4 ACEs, you see fibromyalgia, you see GI problems. This is some of the physical aspects of trauma, okay? Because really toxic stress is a trauma-based response over a long-term exposure. There's a spectrum here, right? So if I'm working with a person that has a lot of emotional pain or fibromyalgia, I'm not going to be suggesting really heavy exercises. I'm going to be suggesting more qigong or yoga-based things, functional movement, even just movement. That way they're not pushing themselves into more pain because of lactic acid and then there's this behavior that happens in certain pain presentations that people, like with fibromyalgia, for example, if they go work out for a couple days, then they stop because they're in more pain the next week.
Right.
So you have to be very mindful of that. It's good to know that because you'll build a better rapport with people if you understand their unique conditions.
It's got to be individual, right?
Yeah, it does. You really got to understand people for what they've been given. Mm-hmm.
And then speaking of pain, you've done a lot of work on pain specifically, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us a
really
little bit about that?
in this. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in private practice, I get to focus on regenerative based procedures. So I got to work a lot more into common musculoskeletal conditions, autoimmune conditions, osteoarthritis, and work with men and women in midlife transition and hormone health. So coincidentally, our hormones are majorly impacted with stress. Any stress, whether you're an adult that you came from a normal family upbringing, if you have chronic stress in adulthood, which a lot of us do, excuse me, our hormones are going to still be impacted because those are pathways that we take cortisol from, and that affects all the rest of our hormones. So that's something we need to consider. But looking at the whole, we are not just like osteoarthritis. I don't just see as just a condition to the joint. It's an inflammatory condition, and there are many factors that affect this. But pain in general is also a very holistic condition. So we can have different types of pain. There's acute pain, but I'm talking more about the chronic pain, and this has more relation to emotions. This has more relation to a lot of the things that we haven't dealt with. Most of that is emotions, actually. It's not just like isolated to that area. And so with this, so a lot of the procedures that I was doing in clinical practice is regenerative medicine, and that included stem cells. Most of the people I'd see were in their middle life years, so about 30 to 60, both men and women. I've seen a lot of autoimmune and a lot of couples I would treat with arthritis, osteoarthritis. And one thing that I draw from all that experience is that the individuals that were not getting success from a lot of the the physical treatments that I was providing them in my assessment, they had issues with them as a couple in their relationship, and more issues. There was more background when you dug into the history of chronic abuse. So they weren't responding as well. So this got me really into the emotional aspects of chronic pain.
So basically, you're telling us that mental and emotional issues can cause chronic pain.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to fix those, and if we want to fix the pain, correct?
Yes, and if we can aim for prevention, that's ideal, right? If we can teach parents, that substance abuse is something we need to address. We all are humans and we have inherent mistakes, but we need to start address. We should never be physical or emotionally abusive. The emotional is the most insidious because that's the one that's hard to detect. When you tell your kid they're not good enough, they're not smart enough, it could be a good family, but even just having that critical parent telling their kid that they have to do better, and never being emotionally there for their kid in terms of how they're feeling, that can be a huge stressor on them. So that gives us an unequal exposure as we're in adulthood to issues with mental health. But there's also in adulthood, we have risk of mental health issues as well. So if we don't start looking at this from a preventative mindset, we're never going to get anywhere. But we're not fixed. We can still change no matter what we were given.
So what's a
there might be more
preventative
physical issues going on?
Right. What's a preventative mindset?
It's adopting learning. It's prioritizing. I can learn. I want to learn. It's questioning, why do I do what I do? Is what I'm doing right for my family? Is it right for my health? Why do I think not talking about feelings matter? Is that really serving the best for my family? And am I there for my kiddo? Am I working too much? Who is my kiddo with? It's this mindset of that. That's the first thing. But there's also a lot more providers becoming more on board with early detection measures for screening kiddos, so that we can give them more mental and emotional support as well in their family.
I find this very fascinating, raising two teenagers, and boys, I think, are just as susceptible to toxic relationships as well as girls.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we had to, as parents, address is the cyber bullying, the keyboard bullying. And it wasn't just children, it was adults as well that were, behind the keyboard saying things that should never have been said to anybody, let alone to a teenager or a kid developing. So, any tips for parents on this? Because, I think with all technology that's out there, that we're going to see more and more of this happening.
Yeah, actually, I think that this is a great point. Thank you for bringing this up, Janet. So if it's kiddos depending on their time of, development, if they're like adolescents or, more going through the teenage years, you have to remember them as in their development. So it's good for parents to learn about from their pediatrician too, like ask questions or ask the pediatrician if they don't have the time for information about how do I understand my kid in their unique timing of development? And then how can I start to have conversations with my kiddo, like at dinner or something, in a routine fashion that starts to talk about this stuff so that you kind of be the buffer for that content. Because really kids what they need is one primary parent that holds that space for them to help them emotionally regulate, to help them understand. I mean, the earlier is the better. Once it's past 7, it could be arguable that their brain is already so conditioned to chronic stress. But I mean, what you're talking about here is cultural changes that we can't protect our kids from necessarily because we all are on social media, right? Yeah, but I think it starts, the most easiest place is to be proactive as the parent in understanding what they're exposed to and bringing up the conversations, because you can't expect your kid to do that. They need to be taught that. And with boys, you make a great you bring up a great point here, because it's a cultural norm for boys not to be emotional, and that is a big problem. I think that is a big problem, and it speaks to why United States has more than 50% of marriages ending in divorce. Men and women have biological differences in their brains, and that's a hormonal relationship. But then we have environmental changes that are changing our brains, and our hormones are changing. So we have more PCOS in women. 1 in 10 reproductive women have higher testosterone than they ever had before. And that has direct behavioral effects, and that has direct communication effects. Boys now, on the contrary, have hypogonadism. There's a lot more hypogonadism in our environment. What that means is lower testosterone, and that affects a male's assertiveness. And so we have to be thinking about all these things that are affecting us in terms of our brain and behavior. Really, it comes down to that too. It's not just one thing, but parents really need to, the best thing parents can honestly do is ask questions and be assertive with that, especially with pediatrics. It's a doctor's job to help inform you guys of what kind of resources there are.
Well, I can tell you, we specialize at Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy. We specialize in hormone replacement. And it is astonishing to me to see how many 20-year-old kids, 20-year-old men, I said kids just because I'm getting older, I guess, and my kids are that age. But it's astonishing to me to see how many 20-year-old men have testosterones in the toilet. And we're talking total testosterone of like 200, and they're 20 years old. And on the contrary, how many women have issues of PCOS and they have high androgens, and yet so then they don't cycle and they can't get pregnant. Can you explain? Those are two different questions, really, or two different situations. But can you explain why you think that's going on?
Oh, this is definitely environmental. I think there are many factors here, but one of the biggest ones are the toxic chemicals we're exposed to. So we have over 50,000 environmental toxicants in the US. There is very little regulation in environmental toxicants and also cosmetics. So there's that piece, but we also know it's been documented in men that their testosterone, their total serum testosterone has been declining every decade. Okay, so they're starting with lower reserves. And that's actually really important to understand, because this has a key influence on brain development, dementia, and depression. So it's like this has a huge impact on behavior. One, if you're not motivated, how are you going to be behaving in terms of food, right? So we end up self-sabotaging in food a lot of times, or we're not going to lose weight. And right now we're dealing with the crisis of 43% of our society in the US is obese, right? And all this hormonal changes, there's the adverse childhood events that play into this, because that changes the stress pathways, but that's not happening to everyone. Not everyone's exposed. 63% of the population across all demographics, whether you're rich or poor, have at least one adverse childhood event occur in their childhood. But if you're exposed to way more of those, your risk of these hormone changes is higher. But then there's all this other stuff with our food. Our food is a big one too, right? Our food is, we have so much chemicals in our food. People have lost what food is about. Food is supposed to be our gas to our car. You wouldn't put dirty oil in your car. And that's hard to tell a brain that's developing when they've been given all the sugar, all this easy stuff that, parents didn't really know, because modern marketing is all about hacking the brain, right? Modern marketing has faulty. It's been, in America, the biggest problem. They've used brain tactics to hack our brain and manipulate us to easily go into the path of ease of wanting to eat lots of good foods, and but aren't good for us. And we've really lost in the sight of why we need to eat too. So I can get on a big tantrum on this.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. We deal with it all the time.
I'm with you too, because I was fortunate to at least grow up with parents that were able to have their, our own food supply was what we generated. So I feel that fast, convenient, and not close to nature is where we've lost some of the nutrients that we need for development. And I think it's a big problem, and it's leading down our health and emotional, over through this whole course of the COVID pandemic. Shawn and I have been saying, one of the biggest problems in our country is really cardiac disease, and that comes from our eating habits and obesity and not having good help with our physical health as well as our sleeping. So all these things kind of correlate together. But I also feel that, and this is maybe off the subject slightly, but I think physically, when we think of the differences in child development, I think there's a change between what happened, in my generation growing up and movement. We moved a lot more. And I think there's something to be said about that too with kids, that they need motion. So if we're not getting them away from their electronics and getting them outdoors and moving, then I think there's problems with that too. I mean, any comments that you might have on that?
Oh, it's absolutely foundational. A lot of the stuff that I studied in neurosciences is functional neurology, and this is in regards to network models. So your sensory input affects your motor output. So if you're not using key movement systems, you're going to have a different cerebellum. These areas that play into cognition. We know now that the cerebellum plays into cognition and learning. We need to be as integrated as possible with our nervous system and sound and taste and touch. But movement's huge. Also, movement helps us get out cortisol. It helps us burn through cortisol. I kind of like to explain it that way. And it helps with sleep as well. So if we are not moving and we have more cortisol production, then that just plays into this whole path of maladaptive behavior. So it's, Janet, a great point here. This is super important stuff. Like, yes, it's important to go back to tradition, but it's also important to notice how much we've adapted. A lot of our primitive responses, like the fight or flight responses that happen today, are not the same as what it was when we were fighting against lions and tigers when we were living out in the forest, right? We need to understand those, and we need to also learn how to unlearn those affecting us.
Well,
and that's part of adaptation.
Absolutely. And one of our primitive responses and adaptations was, being able to store extra calories. And now 43% of Americans store too many extra calories. And that's why we have an obesity problem. So that's really how we've adapted, but not adapted is, our bodies are trained well to store fuel, to store fuel for an emergency. And unfortunately, most of us store too much of it. So movement can help that. Nutrition can help that. And another thing I just want to tack on is that, movement, exercise stimulates testosterone production in men. I'm sure it does in women too. I know the study that talks about it in men. So if, if boys are sitting in front of a video game, playing video games all day long, or even adult men that play video games all day long, you can't really expect their testosterone, to be stimulated as much as they would be if they were going to the gym or doing any kind of workouts, because that would definitely optimize their testosterone more than playing video games. And on the issue with PCOS, movement also is important. PCOS, there's a lot of insulin resistance there and metabolic syndrome there, and a lot of times that's due to obesity and hypothyroidism, and movement can help both of those. So it just, and depression, we've talked about it in this show many times. There is no better antidepressant than exercise, period.
Yeah, because the BDNF production, and that actually, not only is it antidepressive, it also is helping the neurons connect better and also growing new neurons, some of the stem cells we've learned about now. This is some really good. You guys have a lot of information, and I'm really glad to be talking about this with you guys.
Well, thank you.
Something
Thank
I
you for
wanted
being
to mention
on.
really quick though about
Yeah.
the hormone issue. So we shouldn't be blaming people about this. We really want to start to talk about how we can optimize our body and sweating, right? Sweating too, because that gets rid of all these toxins that are affecting our mental health. Okay. But obesity isn't just a one-shot cause, like overabundance in food. There's the environmental issues. There's when I say environmental, there's the toxic stress. What were you raised in? Where were you raised? What kind of materials are you around? What are you putting on your skin? And then how are you living? What's your lifestyle like as an adult? Are you eating a lot of bad food? Are you working 12, 14-hour days, 7 days a week? Are you in a relationship that's invalidating and not emotionally there? All those things are important to consider. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, it's a multitude, that is for sure. And that's one of the things that we do on this podcast. We want to educate and empower individuals that they're in charge of that. One thing that we were doing that I wanted to mention is our wonderful pharmacist Rachel through Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy. She is spearheading what we're calling the Dumpster Fire Challenge 2020. Actually, we didn't call it that. She found that. And what it is it's just a challenge to start moving. And it's a 20-day challenge where you try to go a mile a day for 20 days. So you can go a mile a day either by walking, running, rowing, biking, whatever that is, and it's just to start off a healthy pattern of movement, and then just progress from there, because movement is so important.
Mm-hmm. It really is, and it doesn't have to be rigorous.
No,
small steps. We want to set ourselves up for success. So
right, and
small steps.
Absolutely, it's all about baby steps, and that's why that's why we're doing this 20 miles in 20 days. That's very very achievable for pretty much anybody, and then any kind of program does have to be tailored to an individual. And that's why it's important to to talk to professionals that know about tailoring programs like that, because maybe a mile a day is not enough for some individuals if they're if they're more advanced in exercise.
Mm-hmm. So are you guys doing this in groups?
Yeah, it's group. We have a Facebook group started, and I think we have 20 some people doing it now, and I'm super excited. You get a T-shirt and a medal when you finish. I think the actual start date is November 2nd, and we would love for you to just send people our way, promote it. You don't have to do it. You don't have to be in Moses Lake to do it. You can do it wherever you're located. We've got people from all over the nation that have accepted now. So we just want to promote health and wellness. I think Lindsay is streaming that there.
Dumpster fire. Guys, gotta do this. 2020 challenge.
So that's what we're doing.
So Ashley, I have a question for you. So when you are counseling in patients that didn't improve with your stem cell treatment with the chronic pain, and you dug into their relationship, and there were some toxic things there. Obviously, sometimes we can't avoid things, but how did you help them cope or heal or deal with the toxicity that was there, so their body could heal and get out of the pain or the emotional and mental pain that was causing physical harm?
Yeah, so this goes back to individual. You can't really apply everything to one person.
Right.
So there's a spectrum to this. So if there's somebody I was seeing in chronic pain with bipolar, they need to be very managed on their medications so that they have the insight to start self-reflecting. So why I bring that up is because each person in their individualism may have a different need. And it takes a really well-informed clinician to kind of piece out if they're ready for what you're going to give them. And so some of my most challenging cases were people on 5 or more medications, and sometimes it just took me to really dig in to help them make sure their medications with their provider was well, so that they can then start making small steps and self-care for themselves.
Speaking of toxic stress, is
Yes.
that problems, it's how we engage with our problems. It's how we identify problems and how we react to them. And, we should embrace problems because, for instance, the problem with you being logged off on, off of our call today. Well, you know what? We should embrace that and say, well, it's great. At least we have internet, It's great at least that we have a way to talk to you through video conference. So instead of getting upset and overreacting about it, we should embrace problems. And I think that's one thing. I read a book about that. I can't remember the book, but we should embrace problems. I got another personal story. My wife and I are driving home Friday from work, and tire goes completely flat. It's about ready to fall off the rim. I go ahead and drive to Les Schwab to get the tire fixed. And, instead of getting upset, I just think about, you know what, at least I have a car to replace tires on. So we shouldn't look at it as
gratitude attitude.
Right.
Yes.
Or another one, this is even a more simple one, but I get mad at gophers every season because gophers tear up my lawn, and I love my lawn. And gopher tears up the lawn. And so I'm going there and I'm putting gopher poison out there, and there's a big mound of dirt. I'm thinking, you know what? At least I have a house with a yard with lawn that I get to kill gophers. So embrace the problems. That's a good problem to have. And every problem that we face is a good problem to have. It's all in how you react and how you embrace them and face them.
Yes. So I have the very privilege of, one, going through an immense amount of problems and overcoming that. So I know what it's like from, poverty out and with a health condition too. And then going through medical school and making it out of that and being successful in it. So something that I do think is important to acknowledge, though, and people really want more validation in this is that we all have different layers and amounts of problems, and there is some unfair disadvantage. But if you make the decision today that you have a goal in your life, you can achieve that by allowing yourself to do the work. And it requires that commitment. That's the first commitment, is I am wanting a different life. Where I'm at, maybe I'm just broke in an abusive, physical and emotionally abusive relationship. And that is not the life you deserve. That's the first step to know. And that is not your fate. You can get out of that, but it requires a lot of directed, goal-oriented, and not be alone in your work. That's why providers and coaches and if you're in an acute abusive relationship, that's certainly something you want to work with a therapist or a psychiatrist with. But in general, a coach is great to help you get out of these things, because coaches have all these adversities that they've overcome, and they can give you their process in addition to the sciences that they use.
I love it. I love it, Ashley. That's a great way to end up this show. I think that was just like perfect transition. So I love it. So we're going to sign off for today. Tune in Thursday, our midweek podcast. We will have Dr. Paul Thomas. He is a doctor that still makes house calls. He sent out you can look him up, Paul Thomas, on YouTube, Dr. Paul Thomas house calls, and look him up. And his video went viral because he still makes house calls. I'm super excited to have him on. And so tune in. And as always, tune in next Monday at 1 to 2 p.m., just like you did today. We totally appreciate it. Ashley, thank you for being on today. You have been listening to Hold on.
How do we, if our listeners are interested in your services, Ashley, how would they contact you?
Oh, absolutely. Just go to tribuletcoaching.com. That's the first place to go. And I have complimentary consults on there.
Awesome. I think our producer, Lindsay, is streaming that right now.
Yeah.
And all right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. We appreciate it. You've been listening to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Thank you so much for tuning in today.